What is the scariest story you know to be completely true? Story 1. My cousin picked up a hitchhiker about 20 years ago. He was a nice guy. My cousin was hungry, so he stopped at McDonald's and gave the hitchhiker some breakfast. I dropped him off where the hitchhiker said he was headed. No big deal. The next morning, my cousin was watching the morning news and saw the hitchhiker's face. The man was a serial killer and was killing the people he was giving rides to. The cousin called the police, and the police turned the hitchhiker in. It turned out that the hitchhiker had killed the next person who gave the cousin a ride. He had killed several people who had given him rides. That was his MO. I asked hitchhiker why he had not killed his cousin. But he was a really nice young man, and he bought me breakfast. I couldn't kill someone who bought me breakfast. Story 2. I work with children in foster care. A 17-year-old girl told me she has a secret to tell CASA. The 17-year-old girl in the foster care system is 9 out of 10 because she is a rape. She sat down and told them that her family was cartel and her cousins were enforcers. One day when she was about 8 years old, her cousins took her to the desert where there was a 5-year-old boy. There was a 5-year-old boy there. He was probably the child of a family that owed them money. Usually that's punishment for being smuggled into the country. Needless to say, we had no game plan for that stupid incident. The police basically said, well, if there's no body, there's no crime. The poor girl confessed to being forced to kill the child with her bare hands, and there were no consequences. No justice for her, no justice for the child, no justice for the family. A year later, she will be 18 years old and will face a very different world than the one we claim to live in. Story 3. When I was a kid, there was a peeping Tom in my neighborhood. He was a little older guy named Ralph, lived a couple of houses over, and smoked like a chimney. We knew him because a neighbor once caught him climbing up on the roof and looking through the skylight. The neighbor had left a ladder propped up against the house as he went to work earlier that day, but after that he became like a ghost and was impossible to catch. People found footprints and cigarette butts outside their windows, smelled cigarette smoke, and sometimes saw the glowing red cherry of a cigarette in the woods. Occasionally an angry father or teenager would spot him in the dark and give chase, but he moved like a deer through the woods and no one could touch him. The police brought him in several times, but not for long, I think because he had a disabled wife for whom he was the sole caregiver. He was sort of the neighborhood boogeyman, but thankfully he seemed mostly harmless, if terribly creepy. Many years later, there were a number of burglaries in the neighborhood. At the time, people even joked that it couldn't have been Ralph. One night, a neighbor heard a commotion outside and ran outside to find a strange man lying in his driveway. He called 911, and when the police arrived, they found the man, who had previously been arrested for burglary, in his car nearby and later in his apartment, which had been used during the previous break-ins. How did he end up taking a bloody nap in the driveway? He claims he was jumped from behind in the dark and could not get a good look at his attacker. All he remembers for sure is that the guy smelled like cigarettes. Edit, Deren, a lot of people want to know about the keys. Basically we learned that at one point he was picked up and found a bunch of keys on the pegboard. He claimed he was just collecting keys he found and there was no way to prove otherwise as they were not labeled. So maybe he was an avid key collector. Oh come on. Story 4. This is a personal story. Our family had to stay in a rented house for a few months because my father was spending money very badly. This particular house was owned by a friend of his who is quite wealthy, but his wife has had a long and nasty drug problem and they are getting divorced. So we stayed there quite cheaply. One night near Christmas, I dozed off and woke up to see a woman dressed in white opening a drawer on the other side of the room. I must have made a noise, and she turned and ran over to me and said softly, "I'm sorry." Strangely enough, I did. She looked like Liza Minnelli. The next morning I woke up to find my parents acting strangely, and one of them told me that she didn't know what had gone and what had not. Somehow, I didn't connect the dots until I was older and didn't tell my parents what I saw. They thought it was a dream. Yes, the former junkie owner of the rental house broke in, probably had a key, and I saw her, but I didn't do or say anything. I was probably 9 or so. Story 5. Let me tell you a very personal and very scary story. It's about my best friend in high school. We were driving down the highway in a very ordinary minivan with a very ordinary family. They were on vacation and heading to Disney World. A pickup coming from the opposite direction crossed the center line and hit them head-on. He and his 2 sons were killed instantly. His wife and daughter, youngest, were seriously injured but survived. He was literally one of the 2 or 3 nicest people I have ever met. That morning, we were all ready for a fun family adventure. Cruising down the highway, and then lights out. In a matter of moments. And his wife/daughter was left behind to go it alone. Bad things happen to good people. To everyone. And you don't even know it. As a parent, that's a horrible thing. Story 6. A girlfriend from high school called me late one night after I had gone home and gone to bed. She said something was wrong and asked if she could come over to my house. She was obviously shaken and wouldn't give me any details. So I told my parents and drove to her house. At the top of her subdivision, I ran into a police officer with his lights on. He asked where I was going and I told him about the call from my wife. He let me pass, and as I came over the hill to the cul-de-sac where she lives, there were several police cars around the circle. They watched me pull over and get out. My girlfriend ran out of her house and met me on the street. She explained that someone had broken into my neighbor's house and started hitting him with something heavy. The neighbor managed to get out of the house, went to my girlfriend's house, and started banging on the front door hard. The neighbor fell down on the front porch, bleeding profusely from the head. Her mother looked up and saw the perpetrator walking down the sidewalk toward the front door. She pulled the neighbor into the house, and before the door was fully closed, she punched the perpetrator and closed the door. She then took the heavy tool she used to beat her neighbor and smashed the small window at the top of the door. Her mother began to scream and the culprit turned and walked away in the dark as he did so. I spent the night there, along with a couple of police cars that were outside, and in the morning I could see blood still pooling on the front floor and splattered on the front door from where the killer had swung his bloody tool and smashed the window. No one was ever caught or identified. It was completely random. My neighbor survived and, as far as I know, had no lasting injuries beyond a stapled scar on her scalp. She moved out shortly after the incident. Summary: my wife's neighbor was brutally attacked in her home. She ran to my girlfriend's house, but the attacker escaped after almost entering theirs as well. No one was caught. Story 7. A few days before Christmas 1990, Irene Wuornos was on board. Editor: I'm sorry. For context, she was a serial killer in Central Florida. It's kind of a funny story now that I think about it. When I was 16, I was hanging out with a bunch of rough guys and they let me hang out at one of the bars they owned in Daytona. One night I was leaving at the same time as her and she was pretty drunk, so I gave her a ride because the neighborhood wasn't safe for her. I dropped her off at the hotel where she was staying, a cheap weekly rate, and headed home. A few weeks later I saw her on the news. Story 8. The ex-husband's brother-in-law, with whom he lived from 1998 to 2004, murdered his wife in 2009. The police found only his wife's torso. He had disposed of the rest of his wife's torso, and when the police arrived, somehow he had put her torso in the trash. John was a much better man than his brother. He was super stupid. Crazy and complicated story. Sounds like something my ex would have thought of. I can't prove it, but I know in my soul that John must have accidentally killed or seriously injured Kristen during the fight. I panicked and instead of calling 911, I called my brother. And Mike told him what to do and say. John was dumber than a bag of hair and didn't wipe his ass without consulting his psycho but smart brother. Mike is intelligent but insane and evil. John is true to his story and will die in prison. His brother changed his name and washed his hands of him. I don't know what really happened that night, but he was cut to pieces, and wild stories like OJ's are more like my ex than anything John could have come up with on his own. The only shocker is that it wasn't my ex whose torso was in the dumpster. Story 9. My uncle and his girlfriend were hitchhiking down a Colorado mountain when a man picked them up. A short distance down the road, he pulled over and asked my uncle if he could check his tires. When my uncle got out of the car, the man took his girlfriend and drove off, holding a weapon to her. She quickly opened the door and ran outside while my uncle drove. The uncle and his girlfriend rejoined them and tried to sort out what had happened. Later they saw a story on the news about a serial killer. It was Ted Bundy. Story 10. Our family literally had a party to die for. We hosted a very late Christmas party in March and invited our neighbors, including an elderly couple, and everyone had a great time, except for the elderly couple who said some weird things like, "It was really nice to finally have a good meal." In the end, the elderly couple's husband died about 30 minutes after they got home. To be fair, I think the big buzz at the party was that he was basically already terminal thanks to his health, and it was only a matter of time. Story 11. On my way back from work, a small hatchback passed me. They were driving like mad and had a near miss at very high speed. Suddenly, the same hatchback lost control, hit the barrier first, rolled over, and then slammed into the truck. The driver was decapitated and a man and a small child flew out the window. Needless to say, everyone in that car, including the child, died horribly. I pulled over and drove by with many other cars and tried to help, but the sight of the little child, whose body could only be described as bloodied and twisted, made me lose my footing, and I sat down on the runway shortly before having a panic attack. Honestly, if you are speeding with a child in the car, beware of that car. Story 12. There are so many child abusers applying for foster care. I lived in over 60 homes during my childhood and experienced physical, emotional, and sexual abuse in all but one home. There is not a single foster parent I know who has not been abused. One foster parent in particular creeped me out and always gave me a nightcap before bed. One night, when I didn't drink, my foster dad came into my bed in the middle of the night and woke me up. I cried about it at school and kept telling everyone about it, only to be moved to a home where they started physically abusing me a few months later. Story 13. Richard Chase, a Sacramento vampire. Paranoid schizophrenic, necrophiliac, cannibal, serial killer of the 70s. He only enters people's homes if they are unlocked, because that would be an invitation. The following is an excerpt from Wiki, very graphic, but still leaves out the worst part of what he did. Chase broke into a house and shot Teresa Wallen, then 3 months pregnant, 3 times. He then had intercourse with her corpse while stabbing her with a boucher knife. He then removed multiple organs, cut off one nipple, and drank her blood. He used a yogurt container to scoop the blood from her chest cavity and drank it. He stuffed dog feces from Wallen's yard down her throat before leaving. 4 days later he broke into the home of a 38-year-old woman, shot her friend in the head, shot her 6-year-old son, and her 22-month-old nephew. A visitor knocked on the door, startled him, and he fled, taking the 22-month-old's body with him. The headless body was not found for months. Chase was finally located and caught trying to flee his apartment. A search of his apartment revealed blood from floor to ceiling, the kitchen, refrigerator, and all the dishes and silverware. On a plate in the refrigerator was a human brain. He was found fit for trial and sentenced to death, but he committed suicide by chewing antidepressants. Story 14. This is a personal thing, and I think it's horrible on several levels, but the main one I'll elaborate on at the end. In early 2007, my father was in excellent health. He was working with his PCP to get his cholesterol under control, and his heart seemed healthy from EKGs and whatnot. The outlook seemed good. He caught a nasty flu while on a business trip to Korea, and 2 weeks after returning home, he is still being treated. Like an idiot, he never missed work and even worked long hours. One morning he is found dead at his desk by a colleague after suffering a heart attack. The coroner performed an autopsy and found that his heart had been severely damaged, which would normally take years to heal. The family was devastated. My father's doctor attended the memorial service and tried to think logically about what had gone wrong. We were not sure what was wrong, because all the tests and scans showed that my father's heart was not in danger. We soon learned that the flu virus dramatically increased the risk of heart attack. My father was constantly working to the point of physical exhaustion, making it difficult for his body to fight off the virus, further increasing his chances. His heart damage was caused by the virus itself entering the heart and attacking tissue directly. Many people think of the flu as a mild cold that goes away in a week, when in fact it is a deadly virus that can kill you if proper precautions are not taken. This is why I felt bile welling up in me when someone said to me about COVID-19, "Oh, it's just like the flu, because COVID-19 can kill you, and if you act as foolishly as you did with COVID-19, it will certainly kill you. Will surely kill you." Story 15. Best friend of the family. Single young woman. 80s, bought her first house. Small house in a quiet neighborhood, they were all in my town. She moved in with one small U-Haul. Nice summer weather. Most neighbors would see it and come up to me and introduce themselves. Anyway, it was warm, it was summer, and there was no air conditioning. Some houses didn't have it back then, so she opened all the windows to let the breeze through. Now it was night. Exhausted from the move, she went into the back bedroom and lay down on the bed. The lights were on in the living room/kitchen at the front of the house, but not in the bedroom. I rested for a few minutes and thought about going back to clean up, but fell asleep. He is not sure how long it had been, but a noise woke him up. And when he regained his sense of direction, he realized what it was. Someone was slowly and quietly trying to cut the window screen with a razor blade. Later we figured that they had assumed she was still awake in the light and had sneaked into a dark part of the house to ambush her. She sat up in bed and said, "My magnum is here." She said she heard footsteps of someone taking her ass away. It was lucky for her. She didn't have a gun. She didn't even have a phone hooked up to her house yet. There were no cell phones in the 80s. She had only God knows what. I bluffed my way through it well. I have heard many scary true stories, but this one has stuck with me since I was a teenager. At that moment, she let go of her shot and it worked. Story 16. One of my elementary school friends ended up working as a cartel gunman and lost his life this year in a firefight with the military. It's not a scary story, but it confuses me every time I think back on how different our life paths have been. Story 17. When I worked at a pizza place in a small town, this woman came in every Friday and bought 2 pizzas for her family, 2 kids. One Friday, she came in, made normal small talk, bought the pizzas and left. Less than an hour later, she stabbed her 2 children and her husband in the neck, killing them, and when the police arrived, she tried to cut her own throat. In prison she somehow managed to get a sharp object and stabbed herself repeatedly in the neck, but still survived. I moved away, so I don't know what happened to the rest of the trial and whatnot, but I guess the super nice lady I saw every week just snapped. Story 18. When I graduated from college in the early 90s, I became a high school teacher. My annual salary was $29,000. It was a job I loved. But I had to work a summer job to pay my bills. During that summer job, I broke up a fight between a couple of teenagers. No big deal. The cops came. One of the cops told me, "If you worked for us, you'd make twice as much in overtime pay. Besides, you'd never use a gun, and if you did, it wouldn't be someone you knew or cared about," he told me. I had bills and debts, and a year later I was a young patrol officer. In my mind, it was a way to pay for graduate school. There were no student loans yet like there are today. One day I received a call for backup that a suspect wanted for murder had taken an immigrant family hostage. When I arrived, the sergeant said, "Come with me, we'll set up in the backyard in case he escapes out the back." When I entered the yard, the suspect was running toward the fence. He turned around. Then, like John Wick, he fired several shots. 2 officers were hit, including me. I returned fire and hit him with all 4 bullets. And that was the day I killed my childhood best friend. We were best friends in elementary school. He moved away. But we still saw each other every couple of years. We hadn't seen each other for 5 years before this incident. But I remember him and his warm smile every single day. Every day. I'm sorry, Jose. Story 19. A local guy in this very small rural town was watching Terminator 2 on TV and snapped. He was angry that his sister was picking on him. He took out his gun and killed his mother, sister, 2 brothers, and brother-in-law. He then jumped in his car and fled, and was arrested a few days later at a homeless shelter in a remote state. How did I know about this? The next morning I was out hunting in the woods. I was walking along the creek bed, rifle in hand. Suddenly, a helicopter passed overhead and circled back. I heard a loudspeaker yelling at me to stop and put the gun down. I lowered my gun, slammed it to the ground, and panicked. 15 minutes later, a cop came down the path with his gun drawn. I yelled, "What's going on? What's going on?" They removed my gun, checked my ID, and confirmed that I was not the shooter. They told me they were looking for the man who had killed my entire family about 10 hours earlier. It took them a few days to find him at the homeless shelter and arrest him. Our entire small community was pretty much locked down until they found him. Story 20. I once did criminology research in High Blantyre, a small town outside of Glasgow, Scotland. It was a very rough place then, and we had to sit in our car all night counting the number of people walking down dark alleys and recording the crimes we saw. Spoiler, we saw no crime. A few months later, after the streetlights were installed, we returned to this survey to see if anything had changed. Our car was parked in front of the pub. As we sat there one night, we did not notice that a gang had entered the pub, shot a man standing at the bar in the back of the head, took him to a back room, cut him up, put him in a black bag, and carried him out to be disposed of. My friend Harry and I had clipboards, but no record of the crime. We, as well as anyone else who had been drinking in the pub that night, saw nothing. His arms were found in the sewers and his wife and her boyfriend were arrested for arranging his murder. The pub was 20 miles away, 100 yards from my house in the center of Glasgow. She taught Harry's sister and he taught me. Story 21. I was in the house with a dead body for hours. My brother OD'd in the bedroom across from mine about 2 weeks ago and neither my mother nor I knew about it. The next morning, very strange and a little scary, I got a text from my mom. She had to work at 6:30 a.m., telling me to check on my brother because she had a dream that he died. I went to the front door calling his name, 10:30 a.m., and checked on him, but there was no response. The door was locked, so I unlocked it manually. When I went inside, I did not see him at first, but eventually I walked in and saw him in the corner, purple and crouched down. One of the most traumatic experiences of my life. P.S. Do not take fentanyl. You are not invincible and will surely die. Story 22. One time I was sitting in a cafe with him and we were talking and he casually, at age 11, went up to some government soldiers and said he knew where the insurgents were hiding and led them into a ravine and said the communists were there. The man laughed it off as the funniest LMAO gotcha prank ever. The regime was insanely evil, but the casual manner in which this super-friendly and helpful man talked about leading people to their deaths in a dark canyon and killing them with grenades made me feel deeply cold and uneasy. Story 23. A friend of mine drives an 18-wheeler tanker truck, and he was driving in the winter on a highway in Ohio or Illinois or somewhere notorious for icy conditions. He was heading north when one of the southbound cars lost control on the ice, went over the median, and plowed right into him. He had no chance to get out of the way or slow down. The driver was a woman with her 18-month-old daughter in the back, and the impact killed them both instantly. The worst part was that the husband, the father, was in another car following and had to watch his wife and daughter die with nothing he could do. My friend had to go to therapy for a while after that. Story 24. When I was 13 or 14, I got into role-playing on Play by Post. It was on the official Harry Potter website in the forum section. It wasn't like RPing as a student or anything, it was all made-up characters, and it was set in a bar. The leader of the group was a very talented writer. We started talking OOC and eventually connected via MSN Messenger. He was the first internet friend I made. We were both from Minnesota, which turned out to be not too far away, but we never actually met. He and I became very close over the next couple of years. He was a year older than me, but a very talented guy. He was very well spoken, well read on topics I would never have thought of at his age, and made some very impressive flash animations. Stick death was all the rage at the time, so it was like that. He lived with his grandmother. His mother was a drunk and his father was dead. He talked about being bullied at school, his CRPPY home life, etc. I remember he once told his grandmother that he wanted to kill himself, and she told him that her only response was to do it outside so he wouldn't mess up the house. We talked a lot and got to know each other better as our friendship grew. He would disappear for a week or two due to depression, but he always came back. Until he wasn't. One afternoon, the TV was full of breaking news. There had been a school shooting in his town. I knew immediately who the shooter was, long before it was announced on the news. He had killed my grandfather, my grandfather's girlfriend, a student, a teacher, and himself. A few weeks later, the FBI came to my house for questioning, but I had no idea of his plan. They took my computer to examine our interactions. I personally grieved for him, but he will forever be the school shooter. That is the scariest thing I have ever been involved with. Story 25. My friend was the son of a man who is in federal prison for racketeering, extortion, conspiracy, etc. Basically a crime family. My friend was stupid enough to steal a fentanyl patch from a kid whose mother was dying of cancer and he ended up ODing on fentanyl. The kid went missing shortly after the funeral and was found with his body washed up in some sort of drainage system in the river. Then about 8 years later, in 2021, his brother went missing from a hotel. His cell phone was found in the FB marketplace, but no arrests were made in the case, and his body had only been found a few months earlier in the woods outside of town. Story 26. I once read a diary that my great-grandfather wrote in the trenches of the Newfoundland Division in World War I when he was 16 years old. He was one of those kids who lied about his age to enlist. Because Newfoundland was not part of Canada at the time, all Newfoundlanders had to wear reflective metal triangles on their uniforms, so the Canadians/British could tell who was from Newfoundland and who wasn't. That way the Canadians/British could tell who was from Newfoundland and who was not. In the trenches, every day is different. But every day is also the same. The smell of muddy water seeps into my sinuses and I don't think I will ever smell anything else. I have seen things in my life that no one should see. I am afraid. George is scared too. Bullets all around. And fire. Holy God. Fire. Lord, if I die, please don't let me die by fire. We are going over the trenches today. Lord, please let us return safely. Please don't let us die in the fire. Lord, I miss my mother and I miss my father. This entry was written just before my great-grandfather and over 300 Newfoundlanders were told to go up to the deserted trenches, shoot the enemy soldiers, and flee back to safety. He was one of 4. Another, a childhood friend, George, who had been holding hands so they wouldn't lose each other on the way home, almost made it home together, but ended up being shot, and my great-grandfather had no choice but to drag him into the crater and leave him there. As far as my great-grandfather knew, he bled because he never saw him again, and he didn't want to think he had been shot or burned after he sank into the crater. By fire, he meant a flamethrower. Story 27. I lived on the 15th floor of a high-rise. When I came home from yoga in the morning, the sun was just rising and ambulances and fire trucks were running. As I went to the lobby to take the elevator up to my floor, I heard a policeman talking on his cell phone. No one knows where he fell from or if he jumped. Being the morbid creature that I am, I immediately went up to my room and out onto the balcony. I looked around the pool deck but saw nothing, and when I looked directly down, I saw a man staring at me, obviously hours from death. Not much blood. A few weeks later I ran into an employee of the building and asked him if he knew what had happened. He apparently lived a few floors below me, same floor plan/balcony. He was out drinking with his buddies to celebrate his recent promotion. The video showed his friends leaving his house around 2 a.m. Around 2:20 he went out onto his balcony and for some reason stood on the table. He went out on the balcony to watch the sunrise over coffee and was discovered by a couple a few floors below. Poor guy, he died on impact and lay there for about 4 hours. Story 28. My brother and I were rollerblading outside our apartment. When I arrived, my brother was talking to a stranger walking on the sidewalk. My brother looked at me and said, "Let's go ask Mom, quick," and hurried inside, and I quickly followed. My brother began begging my mother to help this man find his lost puppy. We followed my mother outside, but the man was nowhere to be found. A week later, a neighbor's child was abducted from the house across the street. The puppy's little brother was playing in the front yard. A car came by and called the boy to the window to talk. The man grabbed the boy and tried to pull him into the car. The brother ran over and fought off the perpetrator, but was dragged into the car himself. He was only 10 years old. The kidnapper was Joseph Edward Duncan. I shudder to think that it could have been my brother. Teach your children not to talk to strangers. If they do, be sure to pick them up before you go anywhere with them. It may not be likely, but it's a hard world we live in. Story 29. A man I used to work with, in his early 30s, who was in great shape, never drank or smoked, always showed up to work with a smile on his face, and was almost annoyingly positive about life, was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer that was difficult to cure. He was very open about his lifestyle and took pride in not smoking or drinking. He was truly the poster child for longevity. Chemotherapy had left him bald for months, a shadow of his former self, but he still came to work several times in his wheelchair to share his detailed story with us. He told us all that he was finally in remission. He was still pale and thin, but had regained his strength and could walk. On Facebook, he posted his gratitude for his recovery, for being alive, for being able to enjoy food again, and for being able to play music the way he wanted to. A year after remission, the cancer returned and took his life. This man was innocent and happy-go-lucky. He had courage. When I asked him how he was getting through chemotherapy mentally, he said, "It's me versus my heart." Story 30. A high school senior woke up on St. Patrick's Day to find that 4 students from the same school had been involved in a drunk driving accident the night before while stopped at a red light, all killed. The driver was 100% safe. The driver was 100% safe, but he was so drunk that the police had even come to his house in the afternoon. I will never forget the noise of the lockers in the hallway. The silence. Whispering. Crying. There was no teacher to really teach us. The school just sat there, blocking us from coming out front to avoid the press, for kids wiped out in a matter of seconds. That's why I didn't enjoy the concept of St. Patrick's Day. It was ruined by a woman who made the stupidest decision of her life. I have no sympathy for her. Story 31. When I was 17, I rented an apartment with 3 friends because the rent was cheap and there was no credit check, after about 3 months, I started noticing stains on the concrete and walls in the garage that I thought were rust stains from water damage. I cleaned them off, but they kept coming back. About a year later, I found out that the previous tenant had murdered her husband, dismembered him in the garage, boxed him up, and put him in storage where he lived normally for years. The worst part is that I am not into ghosts, but what happened in that apartment scared us before we knew it. The clocks would never sync up, the shower would activate on its own when we pulled the switch, and the cabinets would open and close when no one was near the kitchen. Story 32. I was 22 or 23 years old and in a managerial position at work, mostly over my hometown people. I kept clashing with one guy and there was a lot of friction there. I was about 2/3 the size of that man. Then one day his name popped into my head and I realized that he was one of the 2 guys who beat a guy to death about 4 or 5 years ago who owed a drug dealer a favor. There were a lot of people at the dumping site when the body was dumped, but they were too scared to document it, but not to gossip about it, and the strange circumstances surrounding the disposal of the body made it a big story at the time of the incident. The man was never charged for the death. I remained vigilant until a year later when I moved to another position in another community. Story 33. My elementary school teacher Grace and her husband Matt adopted 3 children, Jesse, Ezra, and Gloria. The family moved to Qatar because Matt got a job there through an engineering firm. Growing up hungry and in extreme poverty, Gloria suffered from a severe eating disorder. Sometimes she would go days without eating, and other times she would binge eat and scavenge food from garbage cans. While in Qatar, Gloria died suddenly, and an autopsy revealed that she had died of starvation. Grace and Matt were imprisoned for murder and went through a long, confusing, and unfair trial. After almost 2 years, the charges were dropped and they were finally able to return to California. What I personally find so horrifying is that this is a woman I knew well, a teacher with a kind and gentle heart, who cared very much about her students. She got married after our school year ended and Matt and I spent our honeymoon in Australia. She gave each of us a stuffed animal as a keepsake and we picked it up the following school year when she was no longer our teacher. When I saw the news and saw her name, my heart honestly stopped. I can't imagine the horror she and Matt went through, and I don't know exactly what happened. Story 34. When I was in college, a neighbor went missing. After about a week of being searched, things went quiet. A few months later, when we all left the student dormitory, there was a persistent smell near the back door, as if something was dying. When we talked to our roommates, they thought the smell was from our own lack of cleaning and poor sanitation, but they said it was much worse inside the house. Eventually, they found out that their neighbor was missing. Their house was a duplex, and the shared basement was supposed to be locked. The missing man found a way around the lock and hung himself in the basement. He had been hanging there for months and no one wanted to see him because it was supposed to be locked. His body continued to decompose and eventually fell to the floor. I am glad he was eventually found and hope someone is held accountable for not searching the basement of the house he lived in. Story 35. When I was in 3rd or 4th grade, I rode the school bus every day. One day on the way home, I noticed a guy wearing sunglasses, a hat, a goatee, and a hoodie standing on the sidewalk watching the bus. It was a little creepy, but I didn't think much of it, at least not until the next day. I don't remember many details, but one thing I do remember vividly is that it was raining pretty hard that day. I had forgotten about the man from the day before, but between breaks I saw him again. He was wearing the same clothes that covered most of his face, but this time he was holding an umbrella. I assumed he must be the parent of someone who knew we were passing by. Then I saw him again a couple of stops away. A couple more stops and I saw him again. The bus route was such that it was almost impossible for us to cross 3 times by chance, and each time we passed him he stared at the bus. Whatever the reason, I didn't think it was enough to warn an adult at the time, but as the days went by, it began to bother me. I ended up telling my mother, who contacted the school, at which point I learned that several other kids on the bus who had noticed him had already called the school. We contacted the police, and a day or two later the police came and informed us that the man had been arrested for attempted child abduction and had just been released from jail on charges of kidnapping and child abuse. It was helpful that summer when a half-assed hunk of meat in a minivan told me he was a friend of my father's and was supposed to pick me up and buy me food. Story 36. My school accepted terrorists. I am 17 years old and attend a relatively small school in a village in southern England. As a school we occasionally invited outside speakers to our assemblies to talk about a variety of topics. Most of the time they are boring, such as a local police officer talking about road safety, but last Friday we had Letlapum Falili. He was there to talk about apartheid and forgiveness in South Africa. Naturally, this was intriguing and much more interesting than the usual talk. Things were going as expected during the meeting, but then he started talking about how he was radicalized because of racial inequality in South Africa, then jumped ahead a few decades and suddenly started talking about how he was the head of the APLA, a terrorist organization according to the US and South African governments. He then went on to show us how he ordered the slaughter of white civilians in retaliation for government policies and the monkey business of forgiveness, if you will, by the mothers of the children he killed, who forgave him. Further investigation after the meeting revealed that he ordered the massacre of St. James Church. His men threw granadas and used assault rifles on the crows in the church, killing 11 and wounding 49. In a desperate event, he ordered the murder of 5 white schoolchildren. He told the assembly that he left the organization because he regretted the methods he used and was reformed, which is not true. Basically, what puzzles me is how the school decided that this was the right person to visit and give a speech about doing the right thing when he is a literal war criminal and a clear danger to all students. Story 37. I grew up in a small southern town. We lived in a house that was air-conditioned with window air conditioners, no central air. I shared a bedroom with my brother. I was on the bottom bunk and he was on the top bunk, and one night in the early 1990s we went to sleep normally. My brother woke up in the middle of the night to pee. I went down the ladder and saw a man's arm sticking out from under the bottom bunk. My brother peed and woke my father. My father thought my brother must be having a lucid dream from his childhood, but he looked anyway and sure enough, there was a man sleeping under the bottom bunk. He had removed the window air conditioner in the middle of the night, broken in through the window and replaced the air conditioner. My father armed himself and called the police and waited for them to look into my room through the broken door. The small town police live for this nonsense, so they stormed the house like a hostage rescue, pulled out their guns, etc. They pull the man out from under the bed, arrest him and drag him out. We later found out that the man was drunk, thought it was his house, broke in, and didn't want his wife to find him when he came home drunk. 35 years have passed since then. I told my father about the incident, and he said, "You know what? The real story is that the man was staying at a motel across the street. Immediately after arresting him, the police illegally searched his motel room without a warrant. And they found a lot of child pornography in that room, including pictures of sleeping children. He was charged with misdemeanor trespassing and released." Story 38. My family took a spring break cruise. We were there just for fun, and cheap. We were in one of the cheaper cabins, near the top of the ship. We were right below the top deck. One night we were in our cabin. My sister and I rushed out onto the balcony to see what was going on. Once outside, we saw a woman dangle for her life and then fall to the ground right in front of us. She screamed the whole time until we heard a dull thud and splash. The cruise passengers went into full panic mode and performed a rescue operation on board. Fortunately, she was found a few hours later in the night and suffered no trauma, I think, and I can't imagine falling from the 19th floor into freezing water without a life jacket on and watching the ship pull away from you in the middle of the night. Ugh. Story 39. From my personal experience, when I was 16-17, I drove to my friend's house to pick her up before going to a movie. I said to my friend, "The guy in the back of that car?" "No." "Why would there be a man in the back of the car?" But this was before cell phones were common, and we didn't have cell phones, so we couldn't call my friend's parents and tell them to be careful or look outside just in case. He lived in a very quiet suburban neighborhood, so this never happened. Well, we both forgot about this incident, went to the movies, and enjoyed the rest of the evening. At midnight, we both returned to find a bunch of police cars parked next to my friend's house. When we got out, we found that his neighbor's house had been broken into and the perpetrator had been shot. Apparently the thief had a bag full of rope and tape and was going to use it on anyone in the house. For weeks I was in a complete panic and had to check everywhere for people hiding when I went out at night. I only caught a glimpse of the culprit, and since I didn't have a cell phone and didn't feel it was effective, I couldn't warn anyone ahead of time. TLDR, I spotted an intruder near a friend's house, but my friend didn't believe me and I couldn't stop him before he got into the neighbor's house. Story 40. A guy I used to work with lost his wife. His wife was sitting there watching TV, and when she got up to turn off the TV, her eyes went slack and she collapsed. She had a huge brain aneurysm and died on the spot. There were no symptoms, no warning. Nothing. For a young man in his early 20s, the thought that he might end up, just like that, was terrifying. What scared me most was the difference between him and me. He was Irish and had been involved, though somehow he never talked about it, in the atrocities that took place in Ireland in the 70s and 80s. As hard as he is a freak, he is really calm and laughs a lot. After all this happened, he kind of shrank back. He seemed smaller, more diminished. His personality completely changed and he quit his job not long after. We don't really know what happened to him. Story 41. Not to sound scary, but a fellow classmate of mine in high school was considered a hero for saving someone from a house exploding and burning. The story was that there was a meth lab in the garage that had exploded and half of the house was gone, the top of the house had collapsed into the front yard and was partially on fire. A high school classmate of mine smashed out what would have been a second-floor bedroom window and rescued an elderly woman who was a tenant in the meth lab owner's house. The news portrayed him as a hero, but what I learned from murmurs among my group of friends is that this guy, the hero, was actually going around the neighborhood stealing CRP from people's garages. When he broke into the garage, the meth lab exploded, presumably throwing him back 20 feet. He then panicked, heard someone scream, and jumped in to help them. The reason I believe this rumor is because about a month or so before that, a friend of my brother's caught the person who stole the skateboard from his garage. Story 42. It was either the entire narrative arc in Donald Trump's life or this kid in my Catholic youth group who murdered his parents in cold blood with an axe on a snowy night just before Christmas. He chased them through the dark, snowy woods in their nightgowns before beating their mother. But they had it coming. They were strange Catholics, adopted 3 children, but were always threatening me with adoption papers and were unusually strict. I've been to their house and they wouldn't allow me to splash around in the pool. Anyway, Neil Patrick Harris played him, Larry Swartz, in a TV movie. There is also a book called Sudden Fury written about this event. The entire youth group held a support session and attended the funeral mass. But a few days later, Larry spoke up and confessed. Interestingly, my best friend's mother, Hannah Ives, who went on to have a big series as a mystery writer, seemed guilty by the newspapers and news. I defended Larry, as we had been in Catholic youth group together. His sister was Asian and was adopted by another friend. Larry served 2 9-year sentences and then moved to Florida. He eventually died young of heart disease. His brother also killed a cab driver over a change purse, as I recall. Larry was a much better man than Trump, though. Story 43. My sister got engaged and I met her fiancé's family. Her mother came from a conservative, well-to-do family and her father was a blue-collar worker, from the other side of the world. They had been separated for years. The father was a very kind and normal man. The mother was quite mean and critical. Anyway, they met and had tea in his mother's kitchen. Her mother, her fiancé, his brother, and my sister. We were Canadian and my fiancé's family were Americans living in the country, so they were quite conservative. Anyway, my brother started raging about the Canadian healthcare system, socialism and communism, throwing chairs at us, and my mother just sat there drinking tea without saying anything. My sister was shocked. Her fiancé was furious. From then on, the sister and brother never had to deal with that mother again. A few years later, the brother went on a shooting spree, killing many women. According to his diary, he was an incel long before anyone heard the word incel. He also wrote a lot about my sister, whom he called his trophy wife. Story 44. One night when my friend and I were in 9th grade, he was staying at my house for the weekend. He needed to lose weight for wrestling, so we went out for a run. It was about 10 p.m. and it was late December in Minnesota, so there was about 8 inches of fresh snow on the ground. Toward the end of the run, as we approached a dead end that we would use as a turnaround, there was an old Jeep sitting idling in the middle of the road at the end of the road. As we passed the Jeep, out of nowhere it shifted into gear and accelerated straight toward my friend and me. We then began to drive toward my house, which was still a few blocks away. The snow on the sidewalks and streets was so deep that we had to walk on the sidewalks to keep up a meaningful pace, and by the time we got to the house, he had plowed into the snowbank next to us 5 times. So my brother, who was 19 at the time, took an unloaded shotgun out of my dad's gun safe, went outside, pumped it up and pointed it at the Jeep. The guy ran out into the yard and knocked over the mailbox, but my brother managed to track down the license plate and we called the police. The police did nothing and assumed that we had somehow provoked or pranked the man. My brother gave the police the license plate number, but when we contacted them, they heard nothing. My friend and I never went on the night run again and never saw the Jeep again. Story 45. My family actually experienced the paranormal. When my mother was pregnant, she said she saw the spirit of her father coming through the window of the house we were living in at the time. She also believed that if the spirit touched her, she would die. My mother did not die, but my sister, who was still very young at the time, gave birth stillborn. When we lived there was a lot of strange activity in that house. I was only about 6 years old, but I was a child who could not sleep at night. I had trouble sleeping, and I remember one night looking out the window just after midnight and seeing 2 creatures peeking in, and it took me a minute to scream. My parents came running and my dad looked outside but couldn't find anything. I then began to think that they might have been 2 Indians in costume for a powwow being held in the area, but I don't know what they were doing on our property. I also thought it might have been 2 Bigfoots, since my memory matched their description. Later we lived in a 2-story house and always heard noises upstairs. We investigated and found nothing until one summer day when we heard the noise again. My brother went up the outside stairs. The stairs were old and rickety, but they could support his weight. I went up the front stairs. I was greeted by 2 Indians who said they were looking for a couple of friends. They apologized, not knowing that my family lived on both floors. They left the house and my brother and I followed them, but they were gone within seconds and neither of us saw which way they went. We thought they were ghosts because they were so fast. As I said, my brother and I were right behind them, so there was no time for them to head north or south or across the street or behind the house. We would have seen them. They just disappeared into thin air. I grew up believing strongly in the paranormal, especially ghosts. I worked the night shift and my hair would often stand on end when I left early in the morning. That was my cue to get into my car as quickly as possible and lock the doors. I didn't know what frightened me, but unlike other ghosts I had felt were friendly, I didn't believe this ghost had good intentions. My parents were still living there at the time and I didn't want to put them in danger. I saw nothing. Story 47. Now, this is a personal story because it happened to me directly. I'm a little fuzzy on the details, and I haven't told you about it in a while, so bear with me. When I was a little girl, maybe 7 years old, I was kidnapped by my mother's obsessive ex-boyfriend. I was staying with my mother for a week and we both needed a car to get somewhere. He drove us to a place I had never seen before, but my mother got mad at him and we fought. I think that was his house or something. Because he told us to go inside and eat potato chips while we fought. I don't know how long we waited, but eventually he came inside and casually started talking to me. My mother was nowhere to be found, but when I asked her where she was, she didn't answer. For the next few days I just lived with him. He didn't seem strange, he talked to me and fed me, but other than that he let me do what I wanted. I was getting worried about where my mother was and wanted to find her, but this was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods, so just wandering around was a little scary. I would go into the van and it wouldn't be where I left it, or I would disappear for hours and then come back and make soup as if nothing had happened. As if that was normal. Probably around 2 a.m. on the fourth day, I was sleeping on the couch and felt someone shake me. He must not have been in a very good mood, since the house only had one bedroom. I was too nervous and confused to ask many questions. She took me into the woods and eventually to a van that I had never seen since she left, started the engine as quickly as possible and took us away. I don't know how she got the keys, but she probably left them on the coffee table or something. I don't know how she got the key, but she probably left it on the coffee table or something. What happened was that after she got into an argument with her ex, he choked her until she passed out and drove the van with her on it to a trail in the woods. He tied her there for days and basically visited her to torture her. So. My mother is an as_hole. My mother is not a nice person and never has been. But even now, knowing what I know about my mother, the fact that she went through that makes my skin crawl. But what worries me the most is when I was with him. He seemed so normal. He was never mean to me, never tried to hurt me. He didn't seem to think I was there, but I was. Why didn't he do anything to me? Maybe he was thinking about it. Maybe I don't want to know. I don't. But this experience in particular will always stick with me, like a nightmare. Story 49. My mother's senior went missing for over a month in 2017. She was last seen by a friend in a car with a group of suspicious men. She did not return to school or show up for several weeks after that until she was reported missing. It turned out that her estranged older brother had plotted her murder in accordance with her mother's wishes. Her brother had always been violent, skipping school and dropping out of school. On the fateful day, he and a few friends picked up his sister from her exams. They set her up, and drove her to a secluded place, where they roughed her up, beat her, hammered her, and strangled her. After the ordeal, they placed a plastic bag over her head and dumped her body in a shallow grave. They then captured and killed 2 dogs to hide the scent of the decomposing body, and dumped the dog's corpse in the vicinity. I have deleted much of what I basically wrote in the beginning to explain the details of the macabre incident until she was found and the investigation was concluded.